fragile is political authority when it relies on confidence rather than verification, on narrative control rather than documented process. This hypothetical hearing is not a clash of ideologies, but an examination of systems under pressure, where procedures replace posturing, records interrupt certainty, and the consequences emerge not from outrage, but from what the system can no longer ignore. The House Judiciary Committee hearing room had the quiet confidence of a place accustomed to spectacle. Cameras were already positioned at their practiced angles, staffers moved with rehearsed efficiency, and reporters filled the press riser with the low murmur of expectations that had been written hours earlier, if not days. In this imagined version of Washington, the outcome felt predetermined, not because of evidence, but because of power, seniority, and the familiar rhythm of televised confrontation. Eric Swalwell sat upright behind the dais, shoulders squared. A neat stack of talking points aligned precisely with the edge of the desk. His expression suggested comfort, even anticipation. This was his environment. Questions framed for maximum clip value, accusations broad enough to land without needing proof, and a media ecosystem trained to reward tone over substance. Across the room, Democratic colleagues appeared relaxed, some leaning back, others scrolling through phones, all signaling the same unspoken assumption that this would be another routine performance, another clean victory in the ongoing war of narratives. At the witness table sat Ben Shapiro, alone. No staff, no legal team, no whispered strategy sessions behind him, just a dark suit, a small notebook filled with tight handwriting, a laptop open but untouched, and 8 thick binders stacked neatly to his right, each marked with colored tabs that hinted at obsessive preparation. The contrast was immediate, and to those paying attention, unsettling. This was not the posture of a man expecting to survive a hostile hearing. It was the posture of someone who had already mapped the room. The chairman's gavel struck, a sharp sound that echoed briefly before dissolving into silence. Opening remarks followed, measured, procedural, laden with phrases like democratic norms and the dangers of misinformation. It was all familiar language, designed to frame what would come next as a moral inquisition rather than a factual one. When the floor was finally yielded to Swalwell for the first extended round of questioning, the room subtly leaned forward. He stood slowly, deliberately, allowing the cameras to settle on him. In this hypothetical telling, it was clear he understood the choreography. He adjusted his jacket, glanced briefly toward the press, then turned to face the witness. "Mr. Shapiro," he began, voice smooth, almost cordial, "you've built a media platform that reaches millions of Americans, a platform many argue thrives on provocation rather than responsibility, on doubt rather than trust." He paused, letting the framing do its work. "You've been accused of spreading disinformation, undermining confidence in institutions, and profiting from division. How do you justify the damage such a platform inflicts on our democracy?" It was a question designed to contain its own verdict. In most hearings, that would have been enough. The witness would spend precious minutes objecting to the premise, denying labels, stumbling through a defensive explanation while the narrative solidified around him. Shapiro did not hesitate. "Let me stop you there, Congressman," he said calmly, his tone precise rather than confrontational. The interruption landed harder than volume ever could. "That statement assumes facts not established, and before we proceed, I'd like to clarify the standards we're using." The room shifted, almost imperceptibly. Swalwell blinked once, then again, as if recalibrating. Interruptions were not unusual, but this one felt different. Not emotional, not reactive, controlled. "You've accused me of spreading disinformation. Shapiro continued, eyes steady. In a hypothetical system that values process, accusations require specificity. One claim, one date, one verifiable falsehood. Name it. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough to register. Papers were shuffled. A staffer leaned in slightly, whispering something that did not seem to help. "You've questioned election procedures," Swalwell offered. "Questioning procedures is not the same as asserting falsehoods," Shapiro replied evenly. "If it were, every policy debate in this room would qualify as disinformation. I'm asking for a specific claim on a specific date, proven false. That's how standards work." Silence. In this imagined hearing, the silence stretched just enough to feel uncomfortable. 3 seconds, 5, 7. The cameras did not move. "Can't do it?" Shapiro asked, not triumphantly, but clinically, as if confirming a procedural failure. "Then, before we go any further, let's establish ground rules." He gestured lightly toward the binders, not touching them yet. "Everything I say today will be sourced. Every document I reference will be contemporaneously available for verification. Claims will be tied to records, timelines, and citations. In this hypothetical exercise, transparency is the only protection against narrative abuse." He looked back up at Swalwell. "Can you commit to the same standard?" The question was simple, almost polite. Yes or no, but its implications were anything but. Agreeing meant surrendering the comfort of vagueness. Refusing meant admitting that standards would be applied asymmetrically. "This isn't about me," Swalwell said, a note of irritation creeping in. "You're the witness." "Yes or no?" Shapiro repeated, voice unchanged. "Can you commit to sourced, fact-checked statements?" The jaw tightened. A nod followed. "Of course." "Excellent." Only then did Shapiro reach for the first binder. The sound of it opening was soft, unremarkable, but in this dramatized retelling it carried weight. The colored tab at the front read like a chapter heading rather than an accusation, and that distinction mattered. This was not a rant. It was a sequence. "Let's talk about standards," Shapiro said. "Specifically, how systems respond when potential conflicts arise." He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture broadly. He read. In this hypothetical narrative, what followed was not a declaration of guilt, but a methodical walk through timelines, when warnings are issued, when disclosures are expected, when procedures exist precisely to prevent compromise. Names appeared as part of the scenario, documents described in careful language, always framed as alleged, reported, hypothetical. The point was not the individual, but the mechanism. Swalwell shifted in his chair. His earlier confidence gave way to something more guarded. He attempted to interject, but each interruption was met with the same calm response. "We'll get there, one step at a time." The room, once relaxed, now felt attentive. Even colleagues who had expected an easy exchange were watching more closely, sensing that the script had changed. This was no longer a performance aimed at headlines. It was an examination of process, and process is indifferent to posture. As the first binder closed, without fireworks, without conclusions, the effect was unmistakable. Nothing definitive had been proven. No verdict had been declared. Yet something essential had shifted. The hearing was no longer about ideology or provocation. It was about whether systems could withstand scrutiny when stripped of rhetoric. And in the quiet that followed, before the next binder was opened, the room seemed to understand that whatever came next would be heavier, slower, and far less forgiving. The pause after the first binder closed was longer than protocol required and shorter than comfort allowed. It was the kind of silence that did not belong to anyone in particular. yet pressed equally on every person in the room. The chairman glanced down at his notes, then back up, uncertain whether to reclaim control or allow the moment to pass. Cameras held their framing. No one spoke. Swalwell shifted again, this time less subtly. His fingers tapped once against the wood of the dais, then stopped, as if he'd caught himself performing a habit that betrayed impatience. The easy confidence he had worn at the outset, the expression calibrated for cable panels and viral clips, had dulled. It was still there, but thinner now, stretched over calculation. Shapiro did not rush. He waited until the silence became awkward, then leaned forward just enough to suggest continuation rather than escalation. In any system that handles sensitive authority, he said evenly, there are checkpoints. They exist not because people are presumed guilty, but because people are presumed fallible. He opened the second binder. This one was heavier. Not physically, though it appeared so, but conceptually. Its tabs were narrower, the paper inside more densely packed, as if fewer pages carried more consequence. He did not lift a document immediately. Instead, he looked up, meeting Swalwell's eyes for the first time since the questioning began. Before we discuss individuals, Shapiro continued, we need to talk about rules, not politics. Rules. The word landed with intention. In this hypothetical scenario, he said, clearance protocols are not punishments. They are safeguards. They exist to answer one question only. Can the system trust the person with information that, if mishandled, causes irreversible harm? Swalwell opened his mouth, then closed it again. He glanced toward the chairman, then back at Shapiro, as if weighing whether an objection would help or simply spotlight what was coming. Shapiro proceeded. In our scenario, he said, there is a standard form, call it a baseline disclosure instrument, used across the federal government. It asks about foreign contacts, ongoing relationships, financial entanglements. It does not ask these questions to accuse. It asks them to assess risk. He slid a page halfway out of the binder, not far enough for cameras to read, but far enough to make the gesture clear. Now imagine, he said, that this form is treated differently depending on who fills it out. The room grew still again. Imagine a junior analyst, Shapiro continued, someone with no media presence, no political allies. They disclose a foreign contact, a friendship, a professional acquaintance. No wrongdoing, no malice. In many cases, access is suspended pending review. Careers pause. Sometimes they end. He let that sit. Now imagine, he added, a senior political figure. Same disclosure. Higher stakes, greater access, more visibility. In a functioning system, scrutiny increases proportionally, not decreases. Swalwell leaned back, crossing his arms. It was a defensive posture, subtle but unmistakable. His gaze fixed somewhere just above Shapiro's head, a common tactic when choosing disengagement over confrontation. In this hypothetical, Shapiro said, the discrepancy is not procedural. It's political. He turned a page. What happens, he asked, when safeguards become negotiable? There was a murmur from the press riser, quiet but audible enough to signal attention. This was not the clash they had expected. There were no raised voices, no personal insults. Just an argument about systems, delivered with the patience of someone dismantling machinery piece by piece. Swalwell interjected. You're making assumptions about decisions you weren't part of. That's fair, Shapiro replied immediately, without a trace of irritation, which is why we're discussing documented processes, not motives. He gestured to the binder again. In this scenario, multiple requests are made, internally, quietly, to reassess access. Some are denied, not because the criteria aren't met, but because the cost of enforcement is deemed too high. He paused, then added, "That's not corruption in the cinematic sense. It's worse. It's normalization." The word hung in the air. Swalwell shifted forward now, elbows on the desk. "You're suggesting intent," he said. "I'm suggesting outcome," Shapiro corrected. "Intent is irrelevant when the system produces the same result regardless of motive." He closed the second binder without ceremony. The third followed almost immediately. This one changed the tone. Where the first had introduced procedure and the second had questioned enforcement, the third dealt with influence, not accusations of bribery or conspiracy, but the quieter mechanics of access and alignment. Shapiro did not label it as such. He let the content speak. "In our hypothetical," he said, "fundraising is legal. Advocacy is legal. Association is legal. The issue is not money. It's traceability." He pulled out a single page and held it up briefly before setting it down. "Imagine a web of donors," he said, "not illegal in isolation, but connected by intermediaries. Introductions here. Fundraisers there. No smoking gun. Just patterns." Swalwell exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound that might have been amusement in another context, but here read as irritation. "Patterns are not proof," he said. "Correct," Shapiro replied. "Which is why patterns don't convict, they inform." He leaned back slightly. "In this scenario, the question isn't whether a law was broken. It's whether safeguards designed to detect influence were applied consistently." The chairman cleared his throat, as if considering intervention, then thought better of it. Shapiro continued, "When the same network appears repeatedly, across cycles, across contexts, the system is supposed to ask why. Not to accuse, to verify." He looked up again. "In our hypothetical, that question is never seriously asked." The room felt heavier now, the earlier ease fully gone. Even those inclined to dismiss the premise sensed the accumulation. This was not a single allegation that could be brushed aside. It was a layered critique of how oversight erodes not through dramatic failure, but through selective attention. Swalwell spoke again, more forcefully this time. "You're weaving a narrative." Shapiro nodded once. "Every hearing does. The difference is whether the narrative is anchored to process." He tapped the binder lightly. "And whether the system is willing to examine itself." Another pause followed, longer than the first. The chairman glanced toward the clock, then back to the witness table, aware that time was moving, but uncertain whether stopping the exchange would help or harm. Shapiro closed the third binder. He did not open another immediately. Instead, he folded his hands loosely in front of him. "Up to this point," he said, "nothing we've discussed implies guilt. In this hypothetical, no one has been convicted. No law has been declared broken." Swalwell's shoulders relaxed a fraction, as if sensing a reprieve. "But systems don't fail only when crimes occur," Shapiro continued. "They fail when standards are bent quietly enough that no one feels responsible." He looked directly at Swalwell again. "So let me ask a question, not about you, but about the structure you operate within." The room leaned in almost imperceptibly. "If a system protects authority at the expense of procedure," Shapiro asked, "does it still deserve public trust?" He did not wait for an answer. "That question," he said softly, "doesn't belong to this room. It belongs to the public." He opened the fourth binder. The shift was immediate. The earlier sections had been analytical, almost abstract. This one was personal, not accusatory, but illustrative. It dealt with ambition, with public posture, with how individuals narrate themselves within systems that reward visibility. In our hypothetical, Shapiro said, there comes a moment when oversight collides with ego, when scrutiny is no longer an inconvenience, but a threat. He described, carefully, the way ambition can distort judgment, not as a moral failing, but as a predictable outcome of incentive structures. The words were measured, but the implication was sharp. When the system elevates exposure over restraint, it invites risk. Swalwell's gaze dropped to the desk now, his earlier defiance replaced by something more contained. He was listening, but not engaging. The performance had shifted from offense to survival. Shapiro sensed it. He did not press. He did not raise his voice. He simply continued, laying out how, in this imagined sequence of events, each unchecked exception compounded the next, until the system itself became complicit, not through conspiracy, but through avoidance. When he finally closed the binder, the sound was definitive. "We'll stop there for now," Shapiro said. The chairman nodded quickly, almost gratefully, and announced a brief recess. As people stood, the room buzzed with low conversation. Reporters typed furiously. Staffers whispered. Swalwell remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, staring at nothing in particular, as if recalculating a strategy that no longer applied. Across the room, Shapiro gathered his binders with deliberate care, stacking them precisely, as though the order itself mattered. Because in this hypothetical, it did. And whatever came next would not be about systems in the abstract. It would be about consequences. When the recess ended, the room felt smaller. Not physically, nothing had moved, but perceptually, as if the walls had edged closer while everyone was gone. Conversations died the moment the gavel struck again. People returned to their seats with the cautious body language of those who sensed that the next phase would be less forgiving than the last. Shapiro was already seated, hands folded, eyes lowered to his notes. The binders were stacked in the same exact order he had left them, aligned with the edge of the table as if measured. He did not look up until the chairman acknowledged him. When he did, there was no change in expression, only a subtle tightening around the eyes that suggested focus, not aggression. "In our hypothetical," he said, resuming without preamble, "we've discussed process, enforcement, and selective attention. Now, we need to talk about incentives." He opened the fourth binder. This one did not begin with documents. It began with silence. He let it stretch, just long enough to reset the room's rhythm, then spoke. "Systems don't collapse because one person makes a mistake," Shapiro said. "They collapse because incentives reward the wrong behavior for long enough that deviation becomes expectation." Swalwell shifted forward, fingers interlaced now, elbows planted. The posture suggested engagement, but his eyes betrayed unease. He was no longer scanning the room for allies. He was watching the witness. "In this scenario," Shapiro continued, "public visibility becomes currency. Access to media becomes leverage. The more often someone appears as an authority, the less scrutiny they face as a subject." He finally lifted a page from the binder. "Imagine," he said, "a feedback loop. Appear on television, speak with confidence, be rewarded with more invitations. The repetition itself becomes validation." Swalwell opened his mouth to object, then stopped. Whatever he had planned to say seemed inadequate in the face of the framing. This was not an accusation. It was a diagnosis. "And here's the risk," Shapiro added. When visibility replaces verification, accountability becomes performative. He placed the page back down without reading from it. In our hypothetical, he said, a figure who speaks frequently about oversight, security, and ethics begins to internalize the role, not as a responsibility, but as an identity. Criticism feels illegitimate, not because it's wrong, but because it threatens the narrative. The word narrative landed deliberately. Swalwell leaned back again, crossing his arms, then uncrossing them almost immediately, as if uncomfortable with his own defensiveness. His jaw tightened. "You're psychoanalyzing," he said. "No," Shapiro replied calmly. "I'm mapping incentives." He turned a page. "In this imagined sequence, he said, ambition intersects with authority in predictable ways. Decisions become reactive. Optics matter more than process. And when someone challenges that dynamic with documentation rather than rhetoric, the response is rarely substantive. It's emotional." A murmur rippled through the room, quiet but charged. Shapiro continued, "Consider how often public officials are rewarded for certainty," he said. "Not accuracy, certainty. The louder and faster the declaration, the more decisive it appears. Doubt, by contrast, reads as weakness." He paused, then looked directly at Swalwell. "In this hypothetical, what happens when certainty is wrong?" Swalwell's eyes flicked downward again. He did not answer. Shapiro did not wait for one. He closed the fourth binder and opened the fifth. This binder altered the temperature immediately. The earlier sections had been structural, almost academic. This one was visceral, not because of theatrics, but because of what it symbolized. "In any system," Shapiro said, "language reveals instinct." He lifted a printed page, holding it up just long enough for the cameras to register that it existed, then set it down. "In this hypothetical," he continued, "a statement is made in public. It is framed as casual, perhaps even rhetorical, but it carries implications far beyond intent." Swalwell leaned forward now, voice rising slightly. "Context matters." "Agreed," Shapiro said instantly, "which is why we examine context." He began to describe the imagined exchange, not as a quote, not as a condemnation, but as a sequence, a proposal, a response, a rejoinder, words chosen in the heat of assertion. "In this scenario," he said, "the language escalates, not toward persuasion, but toward dominance. The implication is not debate, but enforcement." He stopped speaking. The pause was heavy. "In systems built on consent," Shapiro resumed quietly, "threat language is a warning sign, not because it's illegal, but because it reveals how power perceives resistance." Swalwell's face had flushed slightly now, a thin red line creeping up from the collar. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "You're exaggerating," he said. "People speak loosely online." "Some do," Shapiro replied. "Others speak instinctively." He folded his hands again. "In this hypothetical," he said, "the concern is not that a statement was made. It's that no corrective followed, no clarification, no acknowledgement of overreach. The system absorbed it, normalized it, and moved on." The chairman shifted in his seat. This was dangerous terrain, not legally, but politically. Shapiro continued anyway. "When a system tolerates the suggestion of overwhelming force against dissent," he said, "it sends a signal, not about policy, but about posture." He looked at the committee members now, not just Swalwell, and that signal doesn't disappear when the hearing ends. The fifth binder closed. By now, The room had changed completely. The easy laughter of the morning was gone. Staffers had stopped whispering. Reporters were no longer waiting for sound bites. They were documenting sequences. Shapiro opened the sixth binder. This one was thick. "In our hypothetical," he said, "this is where consequences enter the frame, not as punishment, but as effect." He did not immediately reference documents. Instead, he described timelines, briefings followed by disclosures, appearances followed by amplification. The cadence was deliberate, almost hypnotic. "Imagine," he said, "a system where information flows outward faster than accountability flows inward." Swalwell raised his head sharply. "You're implying wrongdoing." "I'm implying exposure," Shapiro corrected. "There's a difference." He finally lifted a page. "In this scenario," he said, "information appears in public shortly after it is shared in restricted settings. No names are named, no sources identified. Plausible deniability is preserved." He paused, then added, "until patterns emerge." The word patterns again. "Once is coincidence," Shapiro continued. "Twice is curiosity. Repetition is signal." He described, hypothetically, how systems assess leaks, not by confession, but by access, timing, and incentive. How investigations often stall not for lack of evidence, but for lack of will. Swalwell's hands were flat on the desk now, fingers spread, as if grounding himself. His breathing had become visible. "This is speculation," he said. "It's modeling," Shapiro replied, "based on how institutions actually work." He leaned forward slightly. "And here's the critical point," he said. "In our hypothetical, the greatest damage is not reputational, it's operational." The room went completely still. "When trust in containment erodes," Shapiro continued softly, "partners recalibrate. Sources withdraw. Systems adapt. Not in our favor." He did not raise his voice. He did not dramatize. The restraint made it heavier. The sixth binder closed. By now, the arc was clear. This was no longer about one figure. It was about how exceptions compound until standards cease to function. Shapiro did not open the next binder immediately. Instead, he looked around the room, taking in faces, some guarded, some conflicted, some quietly alarmed. "In this hypothetical," he said, "there comes a moment when denial becomes unsustainable. Not because the accusations are loud, but because the mechanisms meant to contain them have failed." He turned back to Swalwell. "This is the point," he said, "where systems choose." Swalwell swallowed. His earlier assertiveness was gone now, replaced by something closer to calculation. He was no longer performing for the cameras. He was assessing damage. Shapiro finally opened the seventh binder, but only part way. "We won't go further today," he said, closing it again. "Not because there's nothing left, but because the next section isn't about hypotheticals." The room tensed. "It's about consequences," Shapiro continued. "And consequences don't belong to witnesses. They belong to institutions." He closed all the binders. The chairman cleared his throat, preparing to move on, perhaps to regain control, perhaps to end the exchange before it crossed an invisible line. But the damage, conceptual, not personal, had already been done. Because, in this hypothetical hearing, something irreversible had occurred. The narrative had lost its monopoly. And whatever followed would not be decided by performance, but by whether the system could live with what it now understood about itself. The seventh binder remained closed longer than any of the others. It sat there like a boundary rather than a document, its spine aligned with the rest, its tabs hidden, as if withholding itself were part of the argument. Shapiro's hands rested on the table, palms down, fingers relaxed, not touching the stack. The restraint was deliberate. He had spent the morning advancing step by step, never rushing, never forcing. Now he paused. "In this hypothetical," he said finally, voice steady, "this is where the system has to decide whether it wants answers or closure." The chairman shifted, uncomfortable with the implication. Closure was what hearings often produced. Answers were far less predictable. Shapiro did not look at him. He looked instead at the room. "Up to now," he continued, "we've talked about safeguards bending, incentives distorting, and patterns emerging without resolution. None of that constitutes a verdict. It constitutes a warning." Swalwell sat very still. His earlier movements, the tapping, the shifting, the reflexive interjections, had stopped. His expression was controlled now, carefully neutral, the practiced face of someone waiting out a storm rather than confronting it. The performance had collapsed inward. Shapiro opened the 7th binder. He did not remove a page. He simply let it open, as if acknowledging what it represented rather than deploying it. "In this scenario," he said, "the system responds not with accusation, but with review." The word review landed softly, but it carried weight. "Ethics inquiries," he continued, "are not criminal proceedings. They do not presume guilt. They exist to restore confidence when confidence has been compromised." He glanced briefly at Swalwell, then back to the room. "In our hypothetical, the trigger is not one document or one statement. It's accumulation." He described the mechanism calmly: how referrals are made, how committees consult counsel, how investigators are assigned not to punish, but to assess exposure. The language was technical, almost procedural, intentionally unglamorous. "Nothing about this is cinematic," Shapiro said. "That's the point." He closed the 7th binder. Only then did he reach for the 8th. This one he opened fully. "In any system," he said, "there is a difference between accountability and consequence. Accountability asks what happened. Consequence determines what changes." He lifted a page, then set it back down without reading. "In this hypothetical," he continued, "the consequences are not immediate. They are bureaucratic." He described carefully how access is reconsidered pending review, how committee assignments become provisional, how leadership recalibrates risk, not publicly, but quietly. Decisions are made not on camera, but in closed rooms where reputational exposure is weighed against institutional stability. Swalwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Shapiro did not look at him. "In such a scenario," he said, "no one is declared innocent or guilty on the spot. But momentum shifts." He paused. "And momentum," he added, "is how systems move without admitting they're moving." The chairman cleared his throat. "Mr. Shapiro," he said cautiously, "we need to be mindful of time." Shapiro nodded once. "Of course." He closed the 8th binder. For a moment, it seemed as though the exchange might simply end there, contained, procedural, unresolved in the way so many hearings are. But then something unexpected happened. A committee member spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, just enough to change the temperature. "In this hypothetical framework," the member said, choosing his words carefully, "wouldn't the responsible course be to ensure that standards are applied evenly, regardless of position?" The question was not addressed to Shapiro alone. It was directed at the room. There was a beat of silence. Then another member, this one from the opposite side of the aisle, nodded slowly. "If nothing else," she said, The appearance of inconsistency erodes trust. It was not a rebellion. It was not dramatic, but it was unmistakable. A fracture, not ideological, but procedural. Shapiro said nothing. He did not capitalize on the moment. He simply waited, allowing the implication to settle without amplification. Swalwell turned slightly toward the speakers, his expression unreadable. He did not respond. Any response now would have risked validating the concern. The chairman moved quickly to regain control, thanking members for their comments and signaling a transition. The hearing, he announced, would move on. But the room did not reset. As the formalities resumed, something had changed beneath the surface. Conversations that would follow would not reference speeches or sound bites. They would reference risk assessments, optics memos, internal emails. Shapiro gathered his binders again, stacking them precisely, his movements unhurried. When he stood, he did not look toward the press. He did not seek acknowledgement from the dais. As he prepared to leave the table, he paused. "There's one final point," he said, addressing no one in particular. "In this hypothetical," he said, "the most consequential outcome isn't reputational damage. It's institutional self-awareness." He waited. "When systems protect certainty over verification," he continued, "they eventually confront a choice: adapt or accept decline." He looked once more at the committee. "That choice, thus," he said quietly, "doesn't belong to witnesses. It belongs to those who design and enforce the rules." Then he stepped back. The hearing moved on. Another witness was called. Another topic introduced. On the surface, the machinery of governance resumed its rhythm. But beneath it, recalibration had begun. In the days that followed, in this imagined sequence, no dramatic announcements were made. There were no press conferences declaring guilt or innocence. Instead, there were requests for documents, reviews scheduled, conversations held behind closed doors. Leadership asked questions they had avoided asking before, not because they believed accusations, but because ignoring process had become riskier than confronting it. In this hypothetical aftermath, committee assignments were discussed quietly, access protocols reviewed. Advisors spoke in careful language about optics and institutional exposure. None of it was public. None of it needed to be, because systems rarely correct themselves in daylight. They do so in response to pressure, not outrage, but understanding. And understanding, once introduced, cannot be unseen. The public, watching from the outside, did not receive a verdict. They received something subtler, a demonstration of how power responds when confronted not with ideology, but with procedure. That was the real story, not whether a man won or lost a hearing, but whether a system, when forced to look at its own mechanics, chose to adjust or chose to pretend nothing had happened. In this hypothetical, that choice remained unresolved, which perhaps was the most honest ending possible.